Greene here. He's the director of Keno Catechetical Institute for the Diocese of Phoenix. Steve is a co-host with his wife, Becky, of the Catholic Conversation radio show, podcasted on iTunes. He holds a master's degree in Catholic Thought and Life from St. Meinrad School of Theology. And in addition to teaching theology, philosophy, ethics, and Catholic studies at a variety of academic institutions, Steve has been presenting on Catholic philosophy, morality, theology, and masculinity for over 20 years. He's been a guest on many Catholic radio and television programs to discuss the faith, has written for Crisis Magazine, St. Anthony Messenger, and the Catechetical Review. Most importantly, he's a husband, father to 6 wonderful children, and he's my good friend. And when he finishes his presentation today on this topic, we will open it up to questions with a single microphone. And so I'll be making my way around to catch the questions. I might ask you to just speak loudly if you're across the room from me. So would urge that for that part of the session, we'll have time for 3 or 4 questions at the end, that you really have a question in mind rather than a statement or a series of statements. A question and briefly so that Steve has enough time to answer. Steve Greene, come on up.
Good morning, gentlemen. I just noticed there's a bunch of water bottles under here. I'd be careful, because I'm betting the Catholic Man Show ones contain more than water. Maybe I will switch. So, great to be with you this morning. Over the years, I've had the chance to have a lot of conversations about atheism, and I've had a lot of conversations with atheists, and to be perfectly honest, with varying degrees of success. Sometimes, thanks to the grace of the Holy Spirit, I think it went fairly well. Other days, to be perfectly honest, it was probably kind of a bad day for God and the Catholic Church when I was doing the representing. So, there's one in particular, though, that stands out to me. 2 years ago, my oldest son, Michael, came home from a homeschool enrichment program that the kids attend once a week with a question. He said, "Dad, how do you talk to atheists?" It turns out that Michael had a classmate who was an atheist. I'll call him Brian. That's not his real name. His real name is Tyler. So anyway, Brian had seen Michael and his friends saying grace before they tucked into their peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and whatever organic, non-GMO, dye-free snack their loving moms had packed for them. And he took it upon himself to just come up to them and randomly announce to them that he was an atheist and that his parents were also atheists. And so when Michael asked me, I asked Michael, I said, "Well, how did you respond when he asked you that question?" And Michael said, "Well, I didn't really know what to say, so I just said, 'Oh, okay,' and then I got in line for recess." Which is probably about as good a response as you can give to a 5th grader who approaches you randomly over lunch and announce unsolicited his metaphysical commitments. So anyway, Michael wanted to get my advice on how to talk to atheists, which was great. Over the course of the next couple of weeks, he and I actually had a series of really good conversations on exactly that question. And then Michael would take our conversations and he would go and try them out on Brian. And it went well, I think, at least for Michael. What ended up happening is over the next 6 weeks or so, Michael kind of began taking on poor Brian as something of a evangelization practicum project, I think. And then eventually some of his Catholic buddies joined in. So I think by the end of the semester, Brian probably wished he had announced his favorite sports team instead of his atheism. Although I should point out, as diehard Packers fans, if Brian had announced his devotion to the Chicago Bears, Michael and I would still have had a series of conversations about defective worldviews and the need to pray for people's conversion. So my point is simply this, and this is probably a news flash to nobody. It is very likely, as atheism becomes ever more popular and more people, as Father Longenecker said, self-identify as nuns, not the joyful Sister Bethany Madonna, gosh, I could listen to her forever kind of nuns, but the nun, one asked about their religious affiliation. It's increasingly likely, I think, that we are going to find ourselves in conversations like Michael's little conversation with his classmate Brian. Which means that our intellectual weapons need to be sharp and polished, because the fact of the matter is, Satan does not just want to seduce our bodies, men. He wants to seduce our minds. He wants to break us not only from the bottom up, but he wants to break us from the top down. And the fact of the matter is that intellectual errors breed moral errors. Sins in the mind become sins in the flesh, and ideas have consequences. So, all that being said, what I want to look at today, and again, like Mike said, this talk is meant to be more of an apologetics presentation. I want to look at 4 questions, and of course there's a million questions you can ask atheists, but I wanted to focus on questions, and when Mike and I were first talking about having me do this, we wanted to focus on questions because I think that's often the most profitable way to engage an unbeliever in conversation. It's generally not all that effective to apply the jerks for Jesus model, where you just run some quick version of philosophical proof at him and then drop the mic and walk off the stage, right? You know, like, anything which had a beginning must have a cause for its existence. The universe came into existence, had a beginning, therefore it has a cause for existence. We call that cause God. Boom, throw down the mic, walk off with a victory sign. You're welcome, Jesus. Happy to help. You know, fist bump. That's not going to get us anywhere. But to engage someone with questions, first of all, it shows that you respect them enough to listen. You got to listen after you ask the question too, by the way. It shows you respect them enough to listen. It gives them a chance to express themselves, which everyone is generally pretty happy to do. And it also gives you the strategic advantage of getting a little sense of where this guy or gal is coming from, which then is going to help you figure out what questions to ask and where you want to go with it. So there's a multitude of questions we could ask. I chose these 4 because I think, in a sense, they're fairly central to this whole God debate, this whole God question. And there's a bit of a narrative flow to these 4, by which I mean they overlap one another a bit thematically. And so that mutual illumination of these 4, I think, can give us a line of questioning that we can use to press the point in some of the weaknesses or inconsistencies in an atheistic worldview. Okay, that being said, a word of caution. As important as these 4 questions might be, they are by no means a silver bullet or some kind of magic spell, right? So if you ask your local friendly neighborhood atheist one of these questions, you shouldn't expect him to just gape at you in awestruck wonder and then suddenly snap out of it and be like, thank you, you brilliant theist. You have totally exposed the irrationality of my entire worldview. Please point me immediately to the nearest RCIA program. I don't want you to have false hopes here. But if we can do this charitably and patiently, and if we're willing to ask and listen, you really can have profitable dialogues with folks. And then you hand them off to the Holy Spirit, and it's the Holy Spirit's job to bring them home, right? Okay, great. We're just offering our 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus has to bless it, multiply it, and meet the need. Truth in love. Veritas in caritate, right? So how we conduct these conversations is always going to be at least as important, and sometimes even more important, than what we say. How we say it can be even more important than what we say. As the great Mark Hart says, speaking about online evangelizing, tweet others as you would wish to be tweeted. All right, to the questions. So the first one, and here's how I'm gonna break these down. So I'm gonna pose the question roughly kind of the way I would say it if I was engaged in this conversation myself. And then what I'm gonna do for each of these is I'm actually gonna quote an atheist, a fairly famous atheist. And I wanna quote the atheist because I want that to demonstrate that, first of all, there's not a uniform, unanimous view, even among atheists, on these questions. Secondly, that they're interested in these questions. And thirdly, that sometimes what atheists say about these questions actually kind of loads our gun for us to some extent, okay? And then I'm gonna look at, so where are we going with this question? What's the point? Why do we ask this question? And then what's our answer as Catholics, right? Because we're gonna get pushback, so we need to be able to speak from our worldview as well. Okay, so the first question. So, help me understand. As an atheist, I'm pretending you all are atheists. As an atheist, how do you explain why anything exists rather than nothing? I mean, what caused the universe or multiverse to exist, and what is causing it to exist right now. So the atheist Richard Dawkins, biologist at Cambridge, author of The God Delusion and a bunch of other anti-theist books, on this question of cosmic origins has this to say. He says, quote, "We can't explain, we being atheists, we can't explain the origins of the cosmos at the moment. In a sense, cosmology is still waiting for its Darwin." End quote. Okay, so where are we going with this question? This question presses the point that the atheist worldview, which inescapably reduces reality to merely matter and motion, right? Just the physical universe, knowable only by the sciences that deal with the physical universe, is powerless to even address the origin of the physical universe. This is the point we're trying to press when we ask that question. Now, why do I say that? So just quickly, for ease of use, I like to use an acronym as sort of a substitute for the words the physical universe. It gets tiresome typing those or just repeating that phrase. So the acronym I use is METS, M-E-T-S. METS stands for matter, energy, time, and space. Matter, energy, time, space, METS. In other words, the four components of the observable physical universe and the total possible subject matter of the physical sciences. That's all the physical sciences can deal with is matter, energy, time, space, METS. Okay, so physics, mathematics, and cosmological science tell us that the physical universe, METS, came into existence, began to exist some 14-odd billion years ago with the Big Bang. So then back to our question, who or what then caused the Big Bang? Now, it could not have been METS, matter, energy, time, and space, since METS did not exist before the Big Bang. So nothing physical can be the cause of the physical universe. This also means that the physical sciences cannot, by definition, have an answer to the question of the origin of the cosmos, to the origin of METS. They have nothing to work with before METS begins to exist. Their subject matter is METS and only METS, and there was no METS before the Big Bang to cause the Big Bang, which means that the atheist right off the bat has a problem. He's eliminated everything metaphysical, meaning in the classical sense just that which is beyond or above the physical or material. He's eliminated everything but METS from his worldview. And now METS meets a question it is powerless to answer. Why does the universe exist? What caused the universe? As Catholics, what is our answer to that question? I want to begin, like every good Catholic would, by reading from Scripture, because that's all we Catholics ever do. Right? You've been to Mass. This is St. Paul writing to the Romans. This is chapter 1, verses 19 through 22. Listen to what he says. "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools." Okay. What St. Paul points out there is this interesting fact. Whether they know it or not, the atheists have pulled off a really impressive thing in erasing God from the universe that he created, caused, and continues to cause even now. Not content with biting the hand that feeds them, atheists have actually figured out a way to deny the hand that made them. So, tip of the cap, that takes some doing, right? The atheist physicist Lawrence Krauss, who's actually right here at Arizona State University, he's our local big-time atheist, was once asked by a Christian in a debate if there was anything that could cause him to doubt his atheism. His response was fascinating. He said, "If I walked out under the night sky some evening and looked up at the sky, and the stars formed themselves into the words, 'I am here,' that would probably make me have some serious doubts about my atheism." And And Dr. Krauss chuckled, and the audience chuckled. Now, I was watching this debate on YouTube, and I was sitting there, I'm like, oh, this is going to be good. This is going to be good. This is going to be good. I was like, Christian, you just served him up on and I was waiting for his Christian debate opponent to pounce. And the laughter subsided, and he said nothing, and the debate went on. I was yelling at I'm a lunatic. I'm a nutcase. I was yelling at a computer. I was like, so what was I yelling about? So he gives this answer. If I walked out in the night sky, looked up at the stars, and they formed themselves and say, I am here, I'd have to have serious doubts about my atheism. I was saying, that's exactly what the stars say. It's just written too big for someone with such a narrow perspective on reality to see it. That's Romans 1, 19 through 22. That's exactly what the stars say. I am here, right? Okay, so we want to have this paradigm in mind. We live in God's universe. He created us, like Sister Bethany Madonna said. You can't escape that. You can deny it, of course, but you can't escape that. So we're entrusted with the truth as Catholics. So look at just the simple argument here. We live in a universe that science tells us, not religion, not theology, not the Bible. The Bible tells us too, but that's another conversation for another talk. We live in a universe that science tells us began to exist, right? We already knew that because we know the Bible. We've read Genesis. Anything which has a beginning has to have a cause. Something has to cause it to begin, to come into existence. The Big Bang demonstrates that our universe, which of course includes METS, matter, energy, time, space, had a beginning. Therefore, the universe must have a cause outside itself. Something, not the universe, that brought the universe into existence. And because all of METS had a beginning at the beginning of the universe, this cause cannot be material and it cannot be in time. So this eternal immaterial cause of the universe, we happy theists call, anyone? God, very good. Yeah, I was going to say starts with G, rhymes with God, but you picked me up there. Good. All right, good. Yeah, God. And notice two things about this simple argument, which you might want to charitably point out to your atheist interlocutor. Number one, it doesn't use faith or religion or the Bible. It just uses physics, logic, and philosophy, right? So the whole, you're always trying to import faith and no, that has nothing to do with what we just said. And then secondly, although it proves only a very thin slice of the God that we love and worship, just his bare existence, that already is enough to refute the atheist. Okay, question number 2. So, help me understand. And you'll notice that I begin my questions with, so help me understand. I don't know if it's in my imagination or not, but that seems to be a fairly effective phrase to preface your question with. And I should say, I genuinely mean that when I'm speaking with atheists and I say, help me understand. I really am trying to say to him, there's something about your worldview that does not make sense to me. But if you can help me figure out why it should make sense to me, knock yourself out, bud. Help me understand. I don't get this. You apparently do, so help me understand. All right, so number 2, help me understand. As an atheist, where do life and consciousness and rational intelligence come from? Because matter isn't living or conscious or intelligent, but we are. And matter can't give what it doesn't have. So how does that work for you, right? The atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel is a professor of philosophy and law at New York University. This isn't the quote I'm using. He's a very honest atheist. He said, I'm an atheist not just because I don't think God exists. I don't want God to exist. I fundamentally don't want the universe to be like that, meaning created and governed by this God. Okay, so Thomas Nagel, professor of philosophy and law, addressing this question, has the following to say. He says, materialism is incomplete even as an account of the physical world, since the physical world includes conscious organisms among its most striking occupants, end quote. All right, so where are we going with this question? This question, like the first, is pressing the point that in the absence of the living, conscious, rationally intelligent God, atheism is left with a universe that contains, as Dr. Nagel points out, living, conscious, rational creatures, but no sufficient explanation for those mysterious qualities. Now, there is no logical answer for this question from within the atheist worldview. Not that there aren't a boatload of wildly speculative proposals, scientists out there, atheist scientists who are trying to invent a narrative that could possibly explain how non-living mets could produce life. I mean, you can't swing a copy of The Origin of Species without hitting one of those. They're everywhere. Materialism, by the way, briefly defined, is not referring to atheists who care way too much about the kind of car they drive or the brand of shoes they wear or how big their big screens are. That's a different kind of materialism. We're talking about the deficient philosophical view that all that exists is mets. Everything is reducible to matter and motion, and they mean that, everything, including us, right? So Thomas Nagel's quote above shows that even many atheists recognize that a materialist atheist worldview cannot, by definition, begin to explain consciousness, rational intelligence, or even the origins of life itself. And neither can evolution, by the way. Darwinian evolutionary theory, which is facing its own crisis as an explanatory theory at the moment, again, another talk for another time, is at best a theory describing the mechanism by which living organisms transform themselves upward into higher species of living organism. But the thing is, evolution needs living, reproducing organisms to work on. Natural selection only works on living, reproducing organisms. So evolution in principle can't even touch the question of the origin of life, except by throwing out, like I said, wildly speculative proposals about how chemicals might have come to life. But I want us to notice the irony for the materialist or an atheist, that in order to even contemplate existence, in order to even formulate their atheist worldview, to communicate it to you online or in conversation or at Thanksgiving dinner, if you're really lucky, to even attempt to answer this question, the atheist must first be living, conscious, and rationally intelligent. This obvious irony led the great British convert G.K. Chesterton to make a simple but profound observation. See if you can track him on this one. He said, if there were no God, there would be no atheists. Kind of cute, isn't it? If you want to never get invited back to an atheist cocktail party, just float that line at the beginning. Okay. But it's a profound point, right? And he's speaking to the truth that we all recognize. With nothing but mets and their byproducts to work with, unbelievers are stuck trying to make a merely physical universe account for things a merely physical universe simply can't account for. And so what happens is a lot of atheists, of course, end up denying the reality of rational intelligence, the reality of mind or intellect or even free will. Others opt to punt the question entirely, and they'll just say, well, listen, we don't know yet, but science will eventually figure it out. Anybody ever heard somebody say that, right? You ask this kind of question and say, well, we don't know yet, but wait for it, right? Science will figure this out eventually. If that's the route that they take, we have to charitably call their attention to the fact that science will figure it out eventually is a dogmatic faith statement. That is not a conclusion demonstrated by a physical science, nor is it an idea that's verifiable or testable by a physical science. That is a dogmatic faith statement in the future explanatory power of the physical sciences. So just charitably point that out to your dear atheist friend. You see, atheists also fall back on the so-called God of the gaps. Only for atheists, their gap God's name is not Yahweh or Allah or Jesus. It's, we don't know yet, science will figure it out. And they invoke this God's name like a mantra every time they can't answer a question. We don't know yet, science will figure it out. We don't know yet, okay, you can go with that, but just remember, that's a faith statement, not a scientific conclusion. Okay, so based on all the great things that science has accomplished, they have faith that science will eventually figure it out. But here's another serious problem for reflective atheists. It's a little sub-question if you want. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, and you can do this when you're in this conversation, let's just say for the sake of argument, we grant that matter can actually explain the human person and all of our complexity with our life and our consciousness, our rational. Let's just grant that matter could actually explain that. If that were true, then on the atheist worldview, what is the human person really? I mean, what are we actually by nature if there is no God and matter just over time generated this, right? Well, in that view, what we are is we're a random accident of physics. We're an unintended outcome of blind evolutionary forces, which did not have us in mind, which didn't notice that we came to exist and won't notice when we go out of existence, go extinct at death. We're a buzzing cloud of atoms. We're a lump of stuff. More on this problem in question 3. So as Catholics, what is our answer to this question? Matter cannot give what it does not have. Now, the so-called God particle, and isn't it interesting that the fundamental physical particle is always referred to as the God particle, the never-ending quest to find the God particle. At the moment, the God particle, so-called, is the Higgs boson, right? The smallest discrete particle of matter from which other subatomic particles and then atoms and then molecules and then compounds, it's the basic physical unit of which everything else is built. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter how many Higgs bosons you gather together, and it doesn't matter how much time you give them. Higgs bosons are non-living, non-conscious, and non-rational. So you can gather all the Higgs bosons in the universe, get them together. What do you have? You have a pile of lumber and bricks. You've got building materials. You can build a really interesting universe out of Higgs bosons. God did, right? But they can't do a darn thing with themselves. And it doesn't matter how long you leave them there. So here's the sticking point. As we know, and as atheists don't, or at least have chosen to forget, consciousness and rational intelligence are all properties of the soul, not the body. Our soul is not made of mets. Body is, not our soul. Our soul is a spirit. Our soul is that principle that gives life and unity to our physical body, and by which we're able to know, will, choose, and love. Paragraph 366, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, reminds us of this fact when it points out that the human soul is not produced by our parents. The physical stuff of conception is, right? Egg from mom, sperm from dad, but not the soul. And the soul is not evolved at the end of some material process, but instead every human soul, that which makes us human, is created immediately at the moment of conception by God. We are willed into existence. So what does that mean? It means that at our conception, God breathes his life into our matter again and brings a new human person into existence. Without God creating a soul, joining a new immortal soul to the physical matter provided by mom and dad, we simply would not come to be. This reality undermines, of course, completely the atheist narrative of the evolution of life, consciousness, and reason. These are not helpful evolutionary byproducts, life, consciousness, and reason. These are powers of the soul that mirrors in us the God who created it, who created us, all of us and each of us in his image and likeness. So far from being just another animal, in reality, the atheist is confronted by God's existence every time he looks in the mirror. Everything unique about the human person, mind, intellect, will, memory, imagination, freedom, self-awareness, the ability to contemplate and ask questions. Everything unique about the human person is metaphysical, immaterial realities. These are all powers of our spiritual, rational soul. And God gave us these gifts. God gave us these powers because he created us in his image and likeness, able to reason upward from the physical universe that he created to the creator. To reason upward from the design of the universe to its designer. to reason upward from the order of the universe to the divine mind, which ordered it and set it in motion. Question number 3. All right, so help me understand. As an atheist, how can you have objective morality? Moral truths that apply to everyone all the time. And what's your basis for being able to claim that any choice or action is truly, actually moral or immoral? This is atheist philosopher Peter Singer. He is, in a deep irony, the chair of bioethics at Princeton University. And this is a quote from a video in which he is arguing, as he does in books and lectures all the time. He's arguing for the right to euthanize disabled infants, legalized infanticide. Here's what he says, quote, "The difficult decision for the parents and doctors is if you want this severely disabled infant to live or not. And once you've decided that the baby should not live, it should be permissible to make sure that the baby dies swiftly and humanely." End quote. You see, on an atheist worldview, once we've shoved God out of the universe that he created, once we have scrubbed his image out of ourselves, at least theoretically, we breed monsters pretty quickly. Ideas have consequences. Okay, so where are we going with this question? This question, the question about, as an atheist, how can you have objective morality, moral truths that apply to everyone? How can you know that something's actually moral or immoral? This is pressing the point that if the atheist is right and God does not exist, then all we are is the random, unintended outcome of the laws of physics in a blind, unguided evolutionary process. We are, on that view, like I said, just cosmic accidents. If that's true, then morality can no more apply to us than it can to a star or a starfish. We are all essentially the same. On the atheist account, the universe is filled with interesting collections of cosmic accidents, just random lumps of stuff, buzzing clouds of atoms. And saying of any of these cosmic accidents, these random lumps of stuff, that they should or should not do anything, that thou shalt or thou shalt not communicate some truth, is obviously meaningless, right? In God's absence, there is no divine, eternal standard of perfection and personhood toward which we can aspire and by which we can evaluate our own acting and choosing. And there is no divine lawgiver, so good and evil, right and wrong, just becomes whatever I, or maybe society, decides it is. And what is commanded or forbidden is simply whatever the law can impose on its citizens. Fyodor Dostoevsky's magnificent novel, The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan, who in the novel is the atheist brother, makes a startling observation. Ivan says, if God does not exist, then everything is permitted. Think about that for a second. If God does not exist, then everything is permitted. This is a brilliant insight. The perfect goodness of God, in whose image we are created, and his perfect divine will are the only sufficient, the only possible ground for universal moral laws that apply to all people in all times, in all places, in all circumstances. If there is no God, the atheist is right, then there's no moral truth that applies to everyone, everywhere. So everything is permitted morally, even if it is forbidden legally or frowned upon socially. Back to Peter Singer. Now, we listen to him make this calm defense of legalized infanticide. We might be horrified. We might be horrified by what he says. But in the absence of God, there is no moral standard by which we can call his proposal evil. And the question of whether infanticide is right or wrong is entirely up to society to decide, or really for any individual to decide for themselves, which is precisely what Singer is arguing. He's simply saying that time has come for society to formally recognize the right individuals have to kill their baby if it's defective or disabled. And now, as we talked about this morning, we are literally inches, a birth canal away from taking him up on this monstrous offer. This is how sideways it gets in a universe that is absent the God who created it. So what is our answer, cancer? Sorry. What is our answer to this question as Catholics? This is St. Paul's letter to Timothy, second letter to St. Timothy, 2 Timothy 4, verses 2 through 5. St. Paul exhorts his friend Timothy, and by extension all of us, preach the word, be urgent in season and out of season, convince, rebuke, and exhort, be unfailing in patience and in teaching, for the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own likings, and will turn away from listening to the truth and will wander into myths. Good job, St. Paul. Way to nail 2019, right? Okay. God exists. He's eternal, all good, all knowing, and perfect. He is the greatest good, and we are created in his image and likeness, which means we're able to know the truth and choose the good, and he made us rational and free so that we could choose to love and serve him. This means that God's will, his commands, order and orient us to our greatest good, to heaven and life and eternity with the Blessed Trinity. The great British apologist Frank Sheed noticed this when he pointed out, and I quote, God's will is the cause for man's existence, so God's will must be the law for man's existence. God's will is the cause of man's existence, so God's will must be the law for man's existence. All right, final question. So help me understand. As an atheist, where do universal human rights come from? For an atheist, wouldn't the value and rights of people logically just be based on how smart or productive or healthy or useful they are? Again, Peter Singer, right? Friedrich Nietzsche, perhaps the greatest atheist philosopher, from his book Will to Power, here's the quote. Another Christian concept, and he sneers when he says the word Christian, another Christian concept, no less crazy, has passed even more deeply into the tissue of modernity, the concept of the equality of souls before God. This concept furnishes the prototype of all theories of equal rights. End quote. It's a pretty interesting observation by Friedrich Nietzsche. Like the uber atheist, right? This question presses the point that the atheist worldview loses its grip on universal human rights, rights that all human beings have just by virtue of being human, when it erases God from the picture. As we already discussed, if God did not create us, then we're just cosmic accidents. If we're not loved into existence by God and created in his image and likeness, we're a buzzing cloud of atoms on our way to extinction, and it makes no sense to say that we have inherent rights. So practically speaking, this ends up linking the idea of the value of the human person and human rights. If the person is not of value and God's not around to decide if the person's valuable, then they have no rights. So if we decide this person is not valuable, the unborn, the disabled, the elderly, the sick, that race, this ethnic group, that national, whatever. If we're calculating human value, that means that we're also doling out and withholding human rights. Here be dragons. This is a monster breeding idea. And Nietzsche ridicules the idea of universal human rights and universal human value. It's crazy. For an atheist, that's obviously not true. We're not equal. Some of us are stupid. Some of us are lazy. Some of us are poor. Some of us are disabled. Some of us are cowardly. If we are calculating value and we are distributing and withholding rights, we're all in trouble. Okay. Nietzsche would have referred to Singer's disabled infant as one of what he called the botched and bungled, a little evolutionary misfire, or as he said, life unworthy of life. Why not just kill it, free up the resources it would otherwise be consuming? All right, if God does not exist, men end up playing God. So what's our answer as Catholics? We say that every human person has a divine origin and a divine destiny. We're each literally loved into existence by the God who wills us to be, and we're made for eternal life with the Blessed Trinity. This means that our dignity, our value as person, and hence our inviolable human rights, are not grounded in anything about us. They're grounded in the will of God. That's where we have our dignity. That's where we get our rights. Even if our parents did not want us, God did. God does. And that's where our dignity rests. God alone is Lord over both life and death, as St. Paul reminds us when he says, both in life and death, we belong to God. So this is the truth. And it's a truth that's, interestingly enough, enshrined in the thesis statement for the United States of America, the Declaration of Independence, when the Founding Fathers said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, meaning you don't even need to make a case for them. It's that obvious. That all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So there you go. It's this truth that Holy Mother Church continues to profess and defend for all human persons. All right, conclusion. As you know, the theme of this year's conference, the New Knighthood, is rooted in Bishop Olmsted's apostolic exhortation to us men to step boldly into the breach, to be ready to do battle for the hearts and the minds of our culture, especially the hearts and minds of the men in our culture. And we are born into a battle, men. Make no mistake about it. We have an enemy who is hell-bent on our destruction and the destruction of all of those entrusted to us for protection. He is, our enemy, the father of lies. And he seeks always to deceive us and lead us astray. But as Catholics, we have been entrusted with the truth. So, let us never forget who we are or whose we are, and let us never take off the armor of God or surrender our sword, but instead, let's submit ourselves to our King like the knights and warriors that we are created to be. In this battle, be assured of my prayers for you, and I would be grateful for your prayers for me. Amen.
We have time for a few questions. Would like to do that in this way. There's a microphone down here on the right side of the stage from your angle. And if you would like to ask a question, make your way down there. We have time for just a few. And please, again, make sure that it's a question and not a homily or something else. Thank you. Dr. Bill.
What is your, go ahead, sorry.
Go.
What is your most favored argument for the historicity of the Gospels?
For the historicity, okay, that's a great question. So his question was, what's my favorite argument for the historicity of the Gospels? First of all, the fact that it's a completely illegitimate move historically, just as history is a science, to discount the Gospels. On what grounds do you say these 4 books about this one guy don't count? It's nonsense, right? They don't say that about historical documentation for any other historical figure. I think a version of the whole Lord, liar, lunatic, or legend argument is effective. I'm sorry, you walked away from the microphone. You're out there somewhere. Okay. You're confronted by Jesus in the Gospels, and he says and does things that are utterly unlike any other religious founder. The whole idea that Jesus is up on the Mount Rushmore of religious founders, with Moses and Buddha and Confucius, and maybe you throw Muhammad up there. That's complete nonsense. He does and says things that separate himself completely from the rest of the pack. And so when he says things like, the Father and I are one, he who has seen me has seen the Father, before Abraham was, I am, and he uses the name that God gives Moses to refer to himself. When he says stuff like that, he presses a decision on us. C.S. Lewis points this out nicely, but he gets it from the church fathers. He's either Lord, what he says he is, or he's a liar, or he's a lunatic, or he's a legend. The legend one, I think, is the way to take that whole art of the Gospels historical question. The legend idea is that Jesus didn't actually say any of that. He didn't actually perform any miracles. He never actually claimed to be God. But after he got himself killed by the Romans, which happened to lots of folks back then, his apostles got together and said, he was such a great guy. It would be such a shame if such a wonderful moral teacher just sort of, fell off the maps of history. Let's cook up this legend. Let's say he claimed to be God. Let's say he did all these miracles. Let's say he rose from the dead, right? So when someone's going to tell a lie, there has to be a point to it, right? Like, what do you get out of that? Well, look at the apostles. What did they, if that's a lie, if that's a legend, if they made up that story, what did they get for it? Power, wealth, fame, popularity, really attractive girlfriends? No, they got killed is what they got. They got ridiculed. They got kicked out of the synagogues. And I think maybe that one floats by us a little bit. All the first Christians were Jews. Their identity was as Jews, and they just happened to believe that that guy was the Messiah. To be kicked out of the synagogue was to be forced out from the chosen people. There's almost not a tragedy in our lives that we could even compare in scale to that, how that would shake their very identity. And so I think it's nonsense. When you look at the whole legend thing, do they make up? No. The Gospels are historical. The resurrection is attested to. And if you read good historians, even non-Catholic ones, they'll usually say that. Yes.
Thanks, Steve. The question I have, I think there's a couple of hidden false premises in our culture today. Number one, that evolutionism is true, that we have descended from apes, which is really lacking in real evidence. And secondly, that creationism is a fairy tale, that the creation story is to be taken literally, and so it can't be ever argued from any rational standpoint. How would you approach a rational argument to the atheist who uses these defenses so sharply as...
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting. I was actually brought up short on this myself a couple years ago. Quick plug for Keno Catechetical Institute, which I happen to direct faith formation. Okay, I had students in one of my classes. I'd been talking about theistic evolution as I understood it at the time, and they came up afterwards and they're like, there's a book you should read, because what you're saying is theistic evolution. Theistic evolution is the idea that evolution is just the mechanism by which God brought diversity and higher life forms to exist. But it's basically kind of a divine watchmaker. So God caused the universe to exist, pre-programmed a couple things, and then got up and walked away. And random chance and mutation just took over from there. A couple things I would do. So number one, in a conversation with an atheist, you're generally not going to be able to make a lot of headway by citing works by Christians, by creationists, by intelligent design. Although I would like to make very clear, I in the last 2 years have done a lot of reading and thinking about this. Don't believe what you hear about the intelligent design movement. It's pseudoscience, it's backdoor creationism, it's bad philosophy trying to do good. It's dismissed out of hand, but it's dismissed out of hands by people who either haven't read it or have and know that it's a threat. The Altenberg 16 is something worth looking up. The Altenberg 16 is a group of 16 world-class evolutionists, biologists, physicists, chemists, that met in Altenberg, I think it's in Switzerland or in Austria. And the entire meeting was to begin the conversation about what new evolutionary theory they could come up with. The reason being Darwinism is just dead. It's dead. It cannot... 150 some odd years ago, it looked like it was going to be able to answer all these questions, but everything science has discovered since has undermined and undermined and undermined Darwinism, even the neo-Darwinian mechanism. So these are 16 atheist evolutionists. They're not meeting to say, should we just go with Genesis? Should we just be creationists, guys? This Darwinism thing is running out of gas on us. We've been trying for 150 years. It's getting worse, not better. No, not at all. They would laugh at the idea. They were there to come up with a new atheistic version of evolution because Darwinism doesn't work. So look up the Altenberg 16. Look up a guy named Stephen Meyer. Stephen with a PH, Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R. He's on YouTube. He's write a lot of great books too. But if you want a quick introduction, look at him on YouTube. He just goes after the scientific evidence that undermines the Darwinian evolutionary account. And then he proposes that there are certain things observable by science for which the best and at the moment only explanation is intelligent agency, meaning not something did this, someone did this. And I won't go into all the details, but Altenberg 16, Stephen Meyer will get you started.
How do you get people to care how do you fight the apathy?
That's a great question. And in all honesty, I think sometimes our culture does that for us. And just again, perfect example. Look at this whole New York abortion law, right? I think that's a great question. I think sometimes the apathy comes from either not fully understanding the implications of where this goes, or not really believing it. For instance, back in 73, I was born in 1973. It's way more important because Bishop was ordained, but I mean, come on. Can I get a little shout out? I was born in 1973. I was born to a newlywed couple who was not planning to get pregnant, to a dad who wanted to go back to school. He was working in a factory, wanted to go back and get a college degree, and I showed up 10 months after the wedding. I wrecked the whole plan. But I was born in July of 73. So I was born 7 months after Roe versus Wade. When Roe versus Wade was passed, one of the warning flags that people raise is they're like, this is a slippery slope. If you legalize the killing of infants in the womb, you're eventually going to legalize infanticide. And people were like, you are nuts. Like that, no one is talking about infanticide. That is a stupid... Fast forward to 2019. New York just passed a law that is different from legalized infanticide by the 6 inches of the birth canal. It is, I mean, we are off the map. So I think one of the ways to combat apathy is to look at the culture and say, do you see this? Do you see this? You're horrified, but you're horrified by Peter Singer standing there calmly saying, if the infant's disabled, the parents and doctors have a decision to make. Should it live or die? If it should die, then we should just euthanize it and get it over quickly instead of letting it starve to death over a series of weeks. So point to those things in the culture and then work on being able to reverse engineer the ideas that made that possible. I'm teaching the deacons a philosophy class right now, the deacon candidates. We did this with the Nazis. We did this with the whole LGBTQ movement. Just start with something that's really wrong in the culture and then just reverse engineer the ideas that made this mistake possible. They all have them. They all have them. Every tragic error in the culture is the product of bad ideas. Like I said, errors in the mind eventually are errors in the will, and then are errors in the body and the culture.
We have time for one more.
By the way, guys, we have lunch after this. I'm perfectly willing to stay and chat with anybody else in line who has questions.
The other thing, Steve, is you're going to do this talk again this afternoon.
Oh, yes, I'm going to do this talk again this afternoon.
So those of you guys in line, if you want to come back and ask your question because you don't get a chance, then please do it this afternoon.
Or if you just want to punish a buddy who went to another session, now you know what to recommend.
I haven't engaged atheists yet, but that's why I'm in this class, because I'd like to be able to, and you have. And when you brought up the argument of using the soul, it was my assumption that an atheist wouldn't believe that there would be a soul.
Yeah.
That's a question.
Yeah, very true. So this is, thank you, because that underscores, of course, one of the difficulties of trying to do this in such a tight window of time. So a lot of times what an atheist will do with something he can't explain is he'll just deny it exists, right? So it can't explain rational intelligence or consciousness. He'll just say, well, there are no minds. There is no rational intelligence. And again, the irony, of course, is he's using his mind and his rational intelligence poorly, but he's using them to claim that they don't exist. It's as ironic as the fact that he's standing in the universe God created, God brought him into existence, God's holding him in existence, and yet he's saying God doesn't exist. The best you can do in those situations is just familiarize yourself with what the church teaches. And this is the great thing about being Catholic. Believe me, guys, if you don't know me, you have a solid sub-genius standing before you here this morning. But I'm a Catholic. I'm a Catholic sub-genius, so I get to stand on the shoulders of giants. I get to use Aquinas' arguments and Aristotle's and Augustine's and Bonaventure's and Anselm's. So there's work involved for when the atheists push back. And when he does that denial, push him on that. Say, listen, man, you realize, you thought of that response. And then ask him the same question, well, okay, if you're saying there is no mind, then how do you trust any of your conclusions? If everything you've ever believed or chosen or thought or decided or concluded or judged to be correct is just the epiphenomenon of biomechanical processes, then why do you have any reason to trust it? In a sense, it'd be a little snarky to say it, but you could almost say, so what you're saying is you don't have a mind? Okay, I'm just going to ignore what you said then and talk to these other people. You wouldn't do it that way, but he's kind of, anyway. So yeah, that's a great question. It just learn what we have as Catholics and then be able to point that at those kind of questions.
Brother Steve, nicely done. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys. Thanks for being here.
Okay, gentlemen, we go to lunch now. Most of you know where that is, but it's behind us in the cafeteria area. Enjoy your lunch. We'll see you this afternoon. Same breakouts.